Goblin Slayer's done, so that means that we can finally finish the rest of the cut content series for Season 1. This time will be episodes 7 to 9, including not only the minor details skipped in the manga that add to the plot and character depth, but also a more thorough explanation as to what Goblin Slayer and Sword Maiden were talking about at the end of episode 9. I'm sure that some of you were at least a little bit confused as to the whole plan that Sword Maiden put together to rid her town of the goblins. I mean, if you weren't looking for the clues and hints and putting them together right from the beginning of the arc, then everything would just seem like a normal adventure. But in actuality, it was something much more meaningful and a story that I personally didn't even expect from a series like Goblin Slayer. So I'll be giving a much more straightforward and thorough explanation behind that once we get to episode 9 later in this video. But let's first start with episode 7, which covers chapters 20 to 23 from the manga. If we skip past the bath scene, we get to the part where High Elf Archer searches for Goblin Slayer in the Watertown's guild building. As she's being stared at and catcalled by other adventurers, Goblin Slayer's also being mocked by them for the same usual stuff that we saw in earlier episodes. High Elf Archer does High Elf Archer things and decides to mess with them a little bit by acting all close with Goblin Slayer to make them jealous. They then proceed to go shopping for not only the canary, but also a new weapon for Goblin Slayer and new clothes for High Elf Archer. During which she makes a rather random comment, asking why humans always wear underwear and if it's really necessary. There's really nothing significant about these scenes, it's more like just something to add a bit of comedy relating to High Elf Archer's character. So let's move on to something a bit more story related then. As they enter the sewers, Goblin Slayer mentions that he gained knowledge of poison gas detection from the coal miners. The others decide to follow suit and also share a bit of information themselves, like how dwarves sometimes die from demons that they dig up, or like how adventurers can carelessly kill themselves with their own gate scroll. That statement leads High Elf Archer to point out yet again how Goblin Slayer's recklessness with the last gate scroll highlights how he really will do anything to kill some goblins. That then spurs the High Priestess to think to herself all the things that Goblin Slayer has done. Set traps, be cunning and merciless, and even eliminate the children to prevent them from growing up and becoming stronger. All of which are traits that Goblin Slayer shares with the very goblins that they're hunting, causing her to draw this connection to what the Sword Maiden was saying during the bath scene, about how he too, like everything else in the world, will eventually disappear. Now, the way that the manga portrays this heavily implies that they were talking about Goblin Slayer's humanity, whereas in the anime, they just made it seem that Goblin Slayer would disappear by one day getting killed through his own reckless actions. I'm sure there's some truth to that statement as well, but I personally didn't get the same message from the anime as the one that they were trying to give in the manga, which to me when I was reading was that though he is still extremely narrow-minded as a person, he's not yet too far gone in his own world of goblin slaying. Yes, he's weird, but he's still able to maintain relationships with others. His humanity is still somewhat there. What I believe that the Sword Maiden was trying to say was that if he continues down this path that he's currently on, there honestly may come a time where nothing would distinguish himself from the goblins. It's during this whole thought process that High Priestess has that they're also crossing a broken bridge with a gap in the middle. As Priestess jumps across, she's supported by Goblin Slayer, who's already at the other side, emphasizing the point that Goblin Slayer is someone that is still capable of caring about things other than, well, slaying goblins. They continue to proceed deeper down in the tunnels, all while actively avoiding all the goblins till they get to the trap room. They fall for the bait and then the big battle breaks out. It's during all the commotion from the ensuing fight that the differences between both mediums really shine. It's because both the manga and the anime have their own unique way of portraying the intense action happening as they take on the Goblin Champion. It's only minor details that are glossed over, like the Lizard Priest's partial immunity to the poison gas, or the goblins being noted to have better than normal equipment, though that last detail would have acted as a subtle hint to the goings-on of the overall arc. The Goblin Champion was also noted by the Lizard Priest to have the same caliber of strength as a silver-ranked adventurer, setting the scale for how strong this type of monster is, and giving him a little bit of confidence that Goblin Slayer should be able to take him down, since they're supposedly equals on the scale. But, as we saw, that wasn't quite the case. So they're swarmed by an onslaught of goblins, who are shown in the manga to adapt fairly quickly to their situation. Instead of continuously running at the wall of magic face first, they instead make their way to the edges and squeeze their way through one at a time, providing for a much tougher situation for High Elf Archer and Dwarf to deal with. and that was even before the priestess dropped the protection barrier after seeing Goblin Slayer getting bodied. So while Goblin Slayer is down and everyone else is on the verge of getting killed or even worse, we get a few flashback quotes from Goblin Slayer's old mentor. Though before the lines talking about being powerless, he first says, "Your ultimate fate, your final doom, is always just a roll of the dice away." A nice little D&D reference that's also followed by him saying how it's a common thing in this world for adventurers to be overrun by goblins. It's these thoughts that trigger Goblin Slayer's rage in the manga. He rejects that outcome and wills himself back up, all while proclaiming that this shall not stand. This sets the tone of the situation perfectly. We see all these panels of High Elf Archer getting dogpiled, Dwarf Shaman trying to save her, even Priestess getting a second chunk bitten out of her. Yet here we have Goblin Slayer remembering how he was taught by his master that this entire scenario was normal. It's just as you'd expect from the manga, adding more detail to various focal points of the action in order to paint a better and darker picture, sometimes quite literally. The anime did skip a lot of action shots of Archer going into rage mode after being violently stripped. And I mean like a serious rage, much more than what we saw in their first adventure. She really does put up a decent fight on her own, killing quite a few with a random club, but it's where she almost gets pinned down a second time that we see her get saved by the dwarf. It's at this point that Goblin Slayer's gotten up and is choking the Goblin Champion, which during the manga is where we read not only the panic thoughts of the champion, but also the inner thoughts of Goblin Slayer himself. The Goblin Champion's just confused as to what this unkillable thing on his back is, never once referring to Goblin Slayer as a human, but just as an it. Meanwhile, we get a glimpse into Goblin Slayer's head, as he asks himself why he feels no pain, referring to it as the supposed indicator for being alive. Though it's the aftermath of the struggle where the manga really shines, by being able to present a much more ominous flow of events. Goblin Slayer slowly gets up. He throws the Goblin Champion's eyeball like it's nothing, then points to each of the goblins asking who's next, all while illustrated in a way that's meant to portray how the goblins see him, as this menacing, undying monster. A goblin even pissed themselves at how scary he looked. I find this to be a recurring theme in the manga, not where the goblins piss themselves, but where they portray Goblin Slayer as this inhumane creature-like monster, giving a different perspective on our protagonist by showing him in a way that the goblins perceive him, once again hinting back at his goblin-like traits and this path towards losing his humanity. So that was episode 7. No cutscenes or anything, just some plot-enriching details and despair-filled panels. Episode 8 is more or less of the same thing, as it continues directly from the previous one and covers chapters 24 to 26 in the manga. We start off with young Goblin Slayer, going through his less than normal version of a training montage with his mentor, later identified as a Rhea, known as Burglar or Traveler. If you're wondering, a Rhea is just a smaller version of humans, sort of like a halfling, like this guy. His master points out 3 things that Goblin Slayer needs to become stronger. Either luck, which his is terrible, intelligence, which he seems to have very little of, or courage, which has yet to be seen. So he tests him with riddles combined with life-threatening tasks, though we get a slightly darker version of the riddle in the manga. It goes black within black within black within black. The answer? A goblin in the womb of a captured woman in a goblin cage in a goblin cave. Yeah, it's pretty messed up. When he awakes from this memory, he's in the Temple of Law, and he's reminded of how he hadn't seen his master in 5 years, giving a slight backstory on how they parted ways, as the Rhea had left to go on a journey of his own. Goblin Slayer then looks over at Priestess, and sees that a healing miracle was cast on her. A powerful one at that, since it left Priestess with no scars. The spell cast was known as Resurrection. No, Goblin Slayer wasn't dead, he was just severely injured. The way the spell worked was by sharing a bed with a pure maiden, then casting the spell, which would then take its effect since the conditions had been met. And that's it. Literally just be in the same bed as a virgin when the spell is cast and then you'll be healed. But since Priestess didn't know the spell, she couldn't cast it herself. Sword Maiden was the one that had to cast it, and she used Priestess as the catalyst to meet the conditions. Now, the reason that they had to get naked is a bit more speculative, but I presume it was to prevent any random materials or pieces of clothing from mending itself into the person's body or contaminating the open wounds. You see, the wounds regenerate over time, and you wouldn't want anything to get in the way of that process. Getting back to the story now. Before he talks to Sword Maiden, he first thinks to himself how his master didn't teach him about how to fight goblins when with a party of others. The very fact that he's considering the safety of his party members shows the impact that they're having on him as a person. Though during the emotional story that Sword Maiden is telling of her goblin encounter, he randomly mentions how he needs to go repair his equipment. Sword Maiden just ignores it and carries on with her story anyway. So from this, you can still tell he's got a ways to go before he can be considered normal. Then insert funny panel of priestess waking up, funny panel of priestess making a pouty face, and funny panel of priestess looking at weapons that clerics from her temple use, and now we're at the repair shop. Turns out, Goblin Slayer being flung into a tombstone actually opened up a secret staircase to a lower level of the sewers, which is what the rest of the party went to go investigate. Priestess and Goblin Slayer stayed behind to run errands, one of which was retrieving the grain from Spearman. It's during the exchange that Goblin Slayer and Spearman actually had a wholesome conversation that was cut out, most likely because they hadn't acquainted themselves from the farm arc as of yet. Goblin Slayer referred to Spearman as the most mobile and trustworthy adventurer that he knows. Then Spearman proceeds to offer his help on their current adventure. Of course for a cut, but it's still something that would be perceived as weird in the anime, given that they hadn't really interacted yet. Of course, Goblin Slayer declines. This is where the rest of his party shows up, and they regroup to discuss strategy based on their findings. But that was cut to instead show scenes of Farm Girl talking to her dad. Essentially, the party came back from their recon mission, and they said that they found something that could pose a threat. Though before getting into it, Dwarf suggests that they talk about it over dinner. High Elf Archer immediately rejects that idea and quotes one of her many rules: no business talk during dinner. So they decide to have dinner first and then talk strategy after, spurring a joke from Priestess saying that Goblin Slayer would have to talk about something other than goblins for once. Lizard Priest laughs and says something to Goblin Slayer that seemed to really resonate with him. He says that the principles of one's party and friends must carry weight with an adventurer, meaning that the rules that are set by the people that are close to him should always be taken into consideration. But it's the word friend that causes him to stay behind and really think about what was just said to him. So as the rest start to walk off, Priestess turns around and grabs Goblin Slayer by the hand, all while Goblin Slayer asks himself if friends is what they've really become. It's a really wholesome scene that is fitting for that point in the manga, since remember, at this point they've already been through a fair amount of adventures together, so they've spent more time with each other in the manga than what we have been shown in the anime, giving the connection between all of them a little bit more weight. I could definitely see it being added as a scene in the second season, as it strongly highlights a turning point in Goblin Slayer's essence as a character. Now let's fast forward to when they face off against the giant eyeball. The anime actually skipped over the group's first attempt at fighting it. Priestess had jumped out to use protection, only for it to be disabled by the main eye's cast of Dispel. Dwarf Shaman then had to run out and use Spirit Wall to protect Priestess, which then easily got destroyed by the smaller eye's cast of Disintegrate, resulting in them having to retreat. On their second attempt, it's pretty much just as we saw. Though High Elf Archer did have thoughts of how if she were more skilled like her sister, she could even attack while dodging the eyeball's attacks. So now you know she has a sister. Then they blow up the eyeball, and we go straight to episode 9, which continues through chapters 26 to chapter 29 of the manga. And I'm sure this is the episode where you have the most questions, because they didn't really explain Sword Maiden's master plan very well in the anime. So as I said, I'll be going over that in greater detail once we get to it. But first, they had to extract the gate mirror, which was a lot more crazy than was shown. The mirror itself was revealed in the manga to be capable of teleportation to multiple different goblin bases, including the ones at the forest ruins that they were previously at, marking the artifact as a very key component to the goblins' operations. As they hear the goblins making their way down the hallways, everyone is then shown to be preparing for the upcoming battle, even Priestess, who was gathering weapons and arrows for everyone to use. Now, before the battle even started, Lizard Priest had cast his strength-enhancing spell called Partial Dragon, which is triggered by praying to the Brontosaurus deity. As you can tell by this panel, it pretty much lets him go Super Saiyan. He uses it to try to get the mirror off the wall, and instead of wedging it off the wall with his weapon like they show us in the anime, he literally grabs it with both hands and tries to pull it off like a beast. So while he's doing that, the next scene in the anime cuts to when the Goblin Champion shows up. But in the manga, they first had a lot of good action panels of Goblin Slayer literally just mowing down endless hordes of goblins with ease. I'm talking like 14 pages of just straight goblin slaying and no dialogue whatsoever. Yeah, we got a few scenes in the anime, but not nearly anything as gratuitous or badass as the panels like these. He's shown going through each goblin in a different method from the last, stabbing one through the neck, then hammering another one's face, then using it as a shield, giving him time to tomahawk the next one, and so on. There are a few things that happen during this that need highlighting as well. The first is that Priestess is waiting for the right time to use her last spell. She doesn't know when, but she knows she has to save it for the right time. The second is yet another portrayal of Goblin Slayer as he's perceived through the eyes of the goblins, once again as this inhuman monster and killing machine, which made for a very nice action shot of him. It even made the goblins cower in fear of him yet again, resulting in the Goblin Champion having to step up. And he's shown to be absolutely furious as his only thoughts are kill, kill, kill. Meanwhile, Archer is running out of arrows, and Priestess actually played a pretty big role in gathering a few more for her to use. She wasn't just sitting there that whole time waiting to use her spell, she was going out of her way to be an active and helpful member of the party. Then when she goes to help the Lizard Priest, he sees that she's really giving her all, and this really gets him going to put all his strength into once again not wedging, but pulling the mirror off the wall with his bare hands. His clothes and everything had ripped from his increased strength. I mean, look at this. This guy lifts. So they finally get the mirror off, and the situation is a bit more tense in the manga, as before Goblin Slayer even gets under the mirror, he tells Priestess to use her Holy Light spell. This ends up blinding him as well, and he has no idea where he's going, so he has to be guided by High Elf Archer to undo the mirror. That's when he tells the dwarf to use Stone Blast and Falling Control to collapse the room. Goblin Slayer almost falls off the high ground that they're on, but both High Elf Archer and Priestess reach out to grab him before he does. As the room is about to collapse, the Goblin Champion gains its vision back to see this gigantic rock about to be dropped on his head. Then the room collapses and the battle is over. So let's take a minute to talk about what just happened. By now, I'm sure you can tell that the manga's portrayal of events presents a situation that seems a lot more intense and epic, not only because of the additional detail, but also with the way that the characters were shown to have grown. You know, where everyone was supporting each other in whatever way that they could. They were acting like a true veteran party. Now, I don't blame the anime for cutting scenes, but I think they could have put at least a bit more effort into making Lizard Priest and Dwarf spells seem as powerful as they did in the manga. But that's just my opinion. Anyway, they had ended up in an ancient labyrinth that was supported by the roots of a tree, which Dwarf had used to collapse the room that they were in. Then they survived because the gate mirror is an always active item, and it sent any debris straight through to the other side of the portal. Now before I move on to the next part with Sword Maiden and Goblin Slayer, here's High Elf Archer's manga reaction to the aftermath, and then him saying that he followed her rules. It's pretty great. Now here we are at the emotional end to the whole Rivertown arc. Goblin Slayer confronts Sword Maiden about her plans. But if you were confused as to what exactly those plans were, don't worry, I'm sure you're not alone. Just forget everything that they had said in the anime. It barely made any sense unless you were already suspecting her of something and actively trying to put everything together from the beginning of the arc. Though, as I said at the beginning of the video, personally, I didn't think Goblin Slayer to be that complex of a show, so I thought they'd give us a more straightforward explanation. I was mistaken. So here's the details of Sword Maiden's plans and her reason for calling Goblin Slayer. Remember the killings that had been happening around town, where the girls were being found dead in the streets night after night? Well, a cult of the Demon Lord was behind those attacks, not the goblins. And Goblin Slayer was able to easily determine this by the way that the bodies were left behind. But he couldn't figure out why she'd lie about it, thus why he's confronting Sword Maiden about it now. Sword Maiden suspected it was the demon cult's revenge on her for eliminating their lord. As retaliation, they infiltrated the city, left a gate mirror in the sewers that led to the goblins' homes, and placed a giant eyeball creature of chaos as a guardian for said mirror. Now, knowing that there were goblins under her city made Sword Maiden unable to fight back, since, as you know, her past experiences with them had traumatized her in a way that has made her too scared to ever confront them. She could handle the demon cult no problem, but goblins being in the mix was something that she was just incapable of handling. This puts her in a rather tough situation, because if she reveals that the demon cult was responsible for the girls' deaths, then as a demon slayer herself, she would be expected to take care of the problem, goblins and all. But she knows that she can't, So she blames the recent deaths on the goblins, hoping to get people to understand the severity of the threat, but of course, they don't. After all, they're just goblins, and the only people who understand how dangerous they are those who experience them firsthand. But almost like a miracle, she one day hears the song of Goblin Slayer, and immediately sends him the quest invitation to slay some goblins. However, by the time Goblin Slayer had accepted the quest and made his way to the river town, the hero had already taken care of the Demon Lord cult, though the Mirror Gate still remained in the sewers along with hordes of goblins. But since the main threat was already taken care of, the hero no longer sees the need of staying, or was just unaware of the secondary threats. Of course, Sword Maiden, still being well aware of it, summons her alligator familiar to guard the sewers from both monsters and anyone that wants to explore. She also kept partial maps of the sewers to prevent any person or adventurer from exploring too deep, just in case they stumbled across the goblins or even the giant eyeball, which are once again threats that she's supposed to be taking care of. Thus why she reaches out for help, to the single person who she feels could understand her feelings. Yet, in the end, he still says he doesn't. He can't. They didn't experience the same thing, and the way they chose to react to it are completely different. Sword Maiden's PTSD causes her to remain traumatized and unable to fight. Goblin Slayer, on the other hand, uses that trauma as his motivation to fight. That's why she loves him, and it's also why he can't save her by being the person she needs him to be. Instead, he can only save her by being this reliable knight in not-so-shining armor, who will always come to her aid should she ever need help with goblins. And that's the whole story behind the Watertown arc. All the pieces were there, but once again, if you weren't actively looking, then you probably wouldn't be able to fit them all together. And the anime did a not-so-great job of doing that for us. So I hope this clarifies that a bit better for you. Anyway, that's all for episode 7 to 9. Kind of a lengthy video, but you know, I always like to be thorough with everything. I'll probably do the last 3 episodes before the end of the month, then I'll take a look at Shield Hero and see if that might be a good show to pick up for this cut content series. Anyway, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time, ciao!